All right, hi guys, and welcome to the Introduction to Japan National Study. This tutorial is primarily for students studying the New South Wales Higher School Certificate, but could be useful for any students who are looking at Japan as a part of their studies. The period that we're going to be focusing on today for Japan is the period from 1904 to 1921, and this tutorial will act as a survey when we look at Japan in more detail and the militarist rise from 1921 all the way through to 1945. The key kind of questions we're going to be focusing on today is how did Japan seek to expand its global power? What were the key consequences for Japan when it comes to World War One? And to give a sense of the period in which Japan is currently going through, looking at the social, political, and economic developments during the particular time. So just to give you a bit of context, for those of you who maybe are a bit unsure or can't remember anything about the Meiji Constitution, so during the Meiji period, we have this huge modernization and development. Japan goes from a legacy of feudal rule into becoming a modern state. And it does this in a very, very rapid, very painful time for Japan. These are some of the key things that happen during that period. We have a new army, they get rid of the samurai, and they create this new modern army using modern weapons. Again, this is a huge redesign of the social fabric of Japan. They introduce mass conscription. No longer is Japan's army made up of elites who are given land for their kind of service in the military. These daimyo, they are now part of a kind of a peasant army, and so there's a real kind of changing of not only kind of the military aspects of Japan, but this affects the social fabric of what Japan is. We have a series of unfair treaties, and Japan is going to seek to continue to expand its influence in the area, particularly when it comes to Korea. We have the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors. This is a form of indoctrination where soldiers are going to swear loyalty to the emperor. A very dangerous element in which instead of serving the nation, they are now serving the emperor's will. We have the Sino-Japanese War, which Japan wins very easily. China is very weak at this period of time. And then we have the Treaty of Shimonoseki, in which they gain Taiwan, which at this time is called Formosa, and the Liaodong Peninsula. An important strip of land in kind of northern China, where they can act as a base of operations. It also has a good port in Port Arthur. Then finally, after this whole period, again, after much kind of deliberation and much discussion, the Meiji Constitution is finally enacted. The unfair treaties on Japan imposed by countries like Britain and America are ended. And they enter into what's called the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, in which Britain and Japan acknowledge each other's interests in China, and they also acknowledge that if they go to war with any more than one power, that the other nation will look to help them. And that idea of more than one power is going to become important because in the 20th century, we're going to see a few wars that Japan's going to become involved in. So the period that we're focusing on begins with the Russo-Japanese War. And this is the point that I said before about the idea of more than one power. Because Japan is going to go to war with one power, being Russia, but not more than one. No other nations are going to be involved. This is pivotal, and it's probably not talked about very much in history because it's a small war. It only lasts for just over a year. But it is the first time that an Asian nation is going to beat a European nation in conflict. This is a huge victory for Japan, and most importantly, a massive humiliation for Russia. And it leads to, if you know your Russian history, things like the 1905 revolution leads to the weakening of the Tsar, who's the king of Russia. They then have this treaty called the Treaty of Portsmouth. Britain are involved in kind of developing it, where they recognize Japan's claims over Korea, and they have a 25-year lease over Port Arthur, which is that port in the Liaodong Peninsula I was talking about. There is a series of kind of agreements to try and quell rising tension with the US, particularly over Japanese immigration to the US. There is a huge amount of immigration, particularly to places like California. And the Californian school districts, threaten that Japanese students will have to go to segregated schools. Japan obviously doesn't want this, and so they say, whoa, okay, we will limit immigration, but you have to continue with integrated schooling for Japanese migrants. Then the big source of trouble in the region is China, okay, who has claims over it, who can trade there. Every single nation wants to carve off a little piece of China. China is very, very weak at this time. They have no real government. The end of the Manchu dynasty, and so each nation is trying to get their dirty paws over China. Japan is then going to annex Korea formally and make Japan and Korea one nation. That's going to continue all the way up until 1945. There's a renewal of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Okay, again, they're recognizing each other's interests in Asia. We have the Taisho political crisis in 1912, where we have a series of kind of tensions and assassinations and rising kind of political conflict. In World War I, we have finally in Japan gets involved, okay, because they're kind of acknowledging that they need to be a part of this World War I, because they've signed this Anglo-Japanese alliance. They siege the port of Tsingtao and the seizure of the German Pacific colonies. They then issue something called the 21 Demands, which is going to try and advance their control over China. Then we get a series of kind of radicalization already happening in Japan. Kida Iki is probably the most famous. We're going to look at him in a bit more detail in class. He has an outline plan for the reorganization of Japan. I definitely recommend you go and read this because it really outlines what the militarist nationalist vision is for Japan. And even though he's not necessarily a part of it later on, this is kind of, you can think of like a seed for this militarist development. The Lansing-Ishii Agreement, which is where they, again, acknowledge to respect China's independence. Again, this is going to be like continually reaffirmed in many treaties. And continually, they said, oh no, like each other can have their own view. Okay, it's okay. You continue to trade, okay, but we can't extend our influence any more than these particular zones. Japan is going to become involved in China. They provide a loan to a warlord to try and further their kind of claims over China, and they get the Shandong Peninsula in return. And these peninsulas like the Liaodong and the Shaodong, okay, are important because they have access to ports. Okay, they're very kind of strategically strong areas. We have the appointment of Hara Takashi as prime minister. Then we have rice riots. We have Japan sends troops to civil war. We have the Paris Peace Conference. We have steel strikes. Then we finally end the period with looking at the Washington Naval Conference. So there's a lot in this period. Okay, it is very much a happening period. Be aware that this is only a survey. So you really just need to, I'm going to think about the kind of key themes from this period as opposed to remembering every single little date or every single little statistic or example. This quote from Kenneth Pyle, okay, a very respected historian, really surmises what the focus of the tutorial is going to be about. And he says that the basic question of this 1920s Japan period is the Meiji Constitution going to absorb the new problems, the new awakening groups, and the modernization, the processes? Is it going to be able to be flexible enough to adapt to this, to accommodate the tensions and antagonisms of a burgeoning industrial society? Is this thing that was developed, throughout the late 19th century, is it going to be able to cope with the pressure put on it in this modernizing era, which has a huge amount of pains? The system that is developed is represented here on the screen. Okay, this is the new political system as a part of the Meiji Constitution. It is highly complex. So I'm just going to break it down into its individual components so you can try to understand how this system works, because it is not like a constitutional system that we see today. There are key forms of oligarchs, these men who are regarded as the best because they're very, very wealthy, the elite. Okay, there are a few groups of them. Okay, the first one over here is these former senior statesmen. They're called the Genro. They have a lifetime appointment, and you can see, advise the emperor. So every source of power comes from linking themselves to the emperor. And so whilst he is a constitutional monarch, his level of influence kind of waxes and wanes. It isn't always consistent. He does have great influence in some periods, and then he kind of goes back. So I don't want you to think about it as, people like Herbert Bix, who writes a great work on Hirohito. He really advocates for Hirohito being very much kind of central figure. But when we look at the Taisho, the Meiji emperor, okay, they're not so much involved. So it's inconsistent between emperors, and it's inconsistent throughout the emperor's rule as well. We then have the armed forces. They play a central role. They also play a role in kind of commanding the army. They also have a cabinet position, the Minister of the Army and of the Navy. So we see an important military role get given in the cabinet. We then have the House of Representatives and the House of Peers. This acts like the House of Peers acts like the House of Lords in the UK Constitution, where they're made up of hereditary positions. It is very much a kind of a system that is built for the elite. Then we have the Prime Minister and his cabinet. The Privy Council, again, is another form of oligarchs as well. And then the courts are appointed by the emperor. So you can see that the emperor sits above this particular system. Japanese citizens only vote for members of the House of Representatives. And even then, it is very much a very limited democracy. When we talk about the Taisho democracy, whilst the Taisho emperor comes into power in 1912 and then dies in 1926, we call the Taisho democracy all the way from the period of 1912 to 1932. So the Showa emperor is going to take control from 1926. So that's called the Showa period. But the Taisho democracy continues all the way up into 1932. It's just a terminology thing that makes it easiest to try and understand when the democracy actually ends. And it's going to end in 1932, to give you some spoilers away. All right, so important thing to notice as well, is that their names are going to be different, just to add more complexity. So Yoshihito, when he becomes emperor, he takes the imperial name of Taisho. So just be aware that when we're talking about different emperors, sometimes they will be using their different names. So Hirohito, who maybe is the Showa emperor. It means shining peace. Many historians point out that this is quite ironic given the fact that he is going to be front and center of Japanese militarist desires in Asia. He takes over as Prince Regent because Emperor Taisho is unwell, and he has quite poor health from 1921, so he gets his hands on the imperial rule quite early. It's not always smooth sailing. He has an attempted assassination in 1923. He becomes emperor from 1926 when Emperor Taisho dies, and then he's finally enthroned in 1928. But we would call the start of his period from 1926. He is theoretically an absolute monarch, as I mentioned. Real power is kind of situating more so with the Prime Minister, the Genro, and the Privy Council, but he has still absolute control. So the day-to-day or the actual, decision-making and power like that rests with the PM, the Genro, and the Privy Council, but he has absolute control. So it's a system where he can choose to intervene if he wants. The Genro, I've put a few key people on there. So Yamagata Aratomo is going to be a leading member. Kinomochi, he's going to be involved in the Paris Peace Conference. He's very anti-militarist. Masayoshi, he is going to be he is previously the financial minister. He's really going to spur this industrial group called the Zaibatsu. We're going to talk about them later on. They're elder statesmen, they're oligarchs, they're elite, they get to choose the PM. No matter who won the election, they choose the PM. That's going to be an important point, because when we get to the Prime Minister, who at this time, 1921, is Hara Takashi, he gets assassinated. This is going to become a reoccurring theme. And as you know, okay, if you look at the news recently, Shinzo Abe, the previous prime minister of Japan, was also just recently assassinated. During this period of time from the 1920s and 1930s, the prime minister's job is very much at risk. It is a prime minister rule by assassination. Many people are going to get assassinated in very, very important political positions by members of the left and members of the right. It is a very dangerous job. So when we look at the parties, there's going to be kind of two parties that really come about. The Seiyukai party and the Miseto party. These are going to be the two leading parties, and they kind of swap control every couple of years because there's always new elections. Only twice is the head of the party who wins the election, the majority party who wins the election, actually appointed prime minister. So that's a really important point. So what we're looking at is a system where the prime minister is chosen from the minority government. What he then does is he calls a new election, and then he tries to get his own party back into power. So power is constantly changing hands in Japan over and over again. The Genrei do this because they believe that the power who wins majority support is unsuitable for the role, and so they put the prime minister of the leader of the minority party into power. He then changes it, and then they continue to change back and forth. There are many prime ministers in this period. The PM gets to choose his cabinet. He could be a member of the Genrei, which is important. He was beholden to these powerful men who selected him for office. The Minister for Navy and Army, these are both very important figures because they have direct access to the emperor, and they also have constitutional autonomy. They're going to be subordinate only to the emperor himself, and they enjoyed great influence in selecting the cabinet and forming policy as well. These ministers are going to become more and more important as we move towards the militarist period. The next kind of key elements is we have the Privy Council. There's 14 of them. They met in secret. They sometimes advise the emperor on constitutional, on budget matters, on international treaties, other laws. Again, they have power because they have access to the emperor, and they can hold up legislation, they can reject it. So they also have a kind of constitutional role as well, and their decisions are going to be final. The cabinet, the executive organ of the government, they make treaties, appoint, dismiss government officials, they declare war. They can be made up of, the two cabinet positions go to the Minister of Army and the Minister for the Navy, and they can be made up of members from both parties as well. They're both the kind of leading parties. So we have the House of Peers and the House of Representatives. The representatives are elected. The peers are a lifetime appointment. They could be hereditary or by imperial appointment. The Diet, which is the parliament, they vote on legislation, but they can only be voted on by male property owners, who are eligible to vote. They vote on legislation, but they really kind of accept whatever the cabinet wanted. And there are, some problems that it causes. The electorate itself, it is very much limited. Not everyone votes, especially not women. Women are not going to get the vote until after the war has ended. But it is only for males who are 25 and above and who pay 15 yen or more in annual property taxes. So we're talking about a democracy here that is ruled by, or that is elected by wealthy landowners. It is very much controlled by an oligarchy where we have members of the elite really kind of choosing and intervening in democratic processes. This is going to change, but at this period of time, it is limited to 1 of every 25 men who are old enough. So we're talking about a very, very small electorate who are actually voting. Not everyone is voting. So I'm just going to pause it there, and we're going to come back to this. So this is the system that we're thinking about. This is the system in which we're going to see the demise of democracy. And you can see already that there's a reason that it encounters problems, is because it is very much controlled by the elite, absolute power is going to rest with the emperor. There is portions of power given to militarists, the minister for the army and minister for the navy, and the prime minister is beholden to, these genro, these senior statesmen who have a huge role in selecting him. And so power is going to constantly switch between prime ministers. We're not going to see a prime minister lasting very long at all. And so Pyle's comments on the key problems are going to be foregrounded as we move into the 1920s. That's going to be all for this initial section on political developments. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the other key points later in the tutorial.